My parents always told me they couldn't afford to help with my wedding because they were living on a fixed income. Yesterday, my brother accidentally screen shared his new property portfolio during a casual family Zoom call. You have to understand our position. Clara, my mother had said, her voice dropping into that familiar, fragile tone she used whenever the topic of money came up. She was carefully smoothing out a wrinkled coupon on her kitchen table. With the cost of your father's prescriptions and our fixed retirement income, we just don't have the liquid capital to help with the wedding venue. We have to be sensible. I remember nodding, a small lump of embarrassment forming in my throat. I am a compliance officer for a local credit union. I look at financial realities every single day, and I knew how inflation was hitting seniors on a budget. I swallowed my disappointment, adjusted our guest list, and spent the next year working extra weekend shifts to cover the down payment on a modest community hall. I never held a grudge. I loved my parents, and the last thing I wanted to do was place an emotional or financial burden on their golden years. For 4 years, my husband David and I built a quiet, disciplined life, believing that both sides of our family were surviving on the bare minimum. We dropped off groceries for my parents, handled their lawn care for free, and politely declined family trips because we thought everyone was struggling to keep the lights on. The fragile illusion evaporated into a high-definition glare at exactly 2:15 p.m. yesterday, since my brother Julian moved 2 states away for his mid-level consulting job. My mother insisted on a monthly family Zoom call to keep everyone connected. Yesterday's call was supposed to be a standard 30-minute chat about my father's upcoming physical therapy schedule. Julian, dear, tell Clara about that new project management software you're using, my mother said, peering closely into her webcam. She was asking about workflow tracking for her bank branch. Oh yeah, it's super easy, Julian said, his voice casual as he clicked around his desktop. Let me just show you the dashboard layout. I'll share my screen. A second later, his camera feed cut away, replaced by his massive desktop display. But Julian hadn't shared the project management software window. He had shared his entire secondary monitor, which was currently displaying an active, open corporate portal for a private real estate holding firm called Apex Ridge Acquisitions, LLC. Right there on the screen, laid out in an immaculate corporate spreadsheet, was a comprehensive property portfolio. My eyes, trained by a decade of asset verification, instantly locked onto the column titled Primary Guarantors. Listed side by side in bold text were the names of my parents, Arthur and Eleanor Miller, alongside my brother's name, and the total net value of the active equity lines attached to their fixed income was a number with 7 digits. The silence on my end of the line was absolute, but the Zoom call kept moving. Julian quickly realized his mistake, his cursor darting wildly across the screen as he closed out the browser tab with a sharp, frantic click. Whoops, wrong window, he mumbled, his voice rising a full octave as he scrambled to pull up a generic software interface. Anyway, here's the project management layout I was talking about. I didn't hear a word he said about the software. My gaze shifted from the shared screen down to the lower corner of the grid, where my mother's video feed was displayed. She wasn't looking at the software. She was staring directly at her camera, her lips pressed into a thin, bloodless line, her eyes wide with a sudden, panicked awareness. She knew exactly what I had seen. Clara, dear, you look a bit distracted, my mother interrupted, her voice shaking slightly despite her best efforts to maintain her usual sweet demeanor. Is the connection lagging on your end? The connection is perfectly clear, Mom, I said, my voice terrifyingly level. In fact, I've never seen things more clearly in my life. I excused myself from the call a few minutes later, citing an urgent compliance audit deadline at the bank. The moment the screen went black, the quiet of my dining room felt heavy and suffocating. I sat there for an hour, my professional brain automatically dismantling the lie. Apex Ridge Acquisitions, LLC. It wasn't just a random investment. As a compliance officer, I have access to public state registry databases for corporate filings. I logged into our secure professional portal and pulled up the articles of organization for the entity. The company had been incorporated exactly 5 years ago, 3 months before David and I got married. The initial funding for the LLC hadn't come from an outside lender or Julian's modest salary. It was a corporate transfer from a private family trust account managed solely by my father. The fixed income my parents lived on was a deliberate financial filter. They had chosen to live frugally in their public lives, pleading poverty to their daughter, while quietly funneling their entire lifetime of generational wealth into a private corporate vehicle managed exclusively by their son. When David came home from his shift at the high school that evening, he found me sitting at the table surrounded by printed corporate registries. Clara, what's going on? He asked, setting his lunchbox down. You look like you've seen a ghost. I did, I said, sliding the corporate registry across the table. I found out where my parents' retirement fund actually went while we were working double shifts to pay for our wedding. David read through the documents, his face morphing from mild curiosity to a deep, heavy frown lines. He didn't get angry. He just looked incredibly tired. He remembered the nights we stayed up late calculating utility bills, the stress of wondering if we could afford to start a family, and the guilt he felt whenever he couldn't provide a luxury experience for my parents. They had millions tied up in residential real estate, David whispered, leaning against the kitchen counter. And they let you feel like you were draining them just by asking for a family dinner. They didn't just hide it, David, I said, the cold professional clarity completely replacing my grief. They structured it to ensure I would never see it. If Julian hadn't shared that screen, I would have spent the rest of their lives paying for their groceries while they built a real estate empire for my brother. The phone on the counter began to buzz. It was my mother. She had called 4 times since the Zoom call ended. I let it go to voicemail, listening to her shaky, overly cheerful voice fill the quiet kitchen. Clara, sweetie, just checking in. Your father and I wanted to see if you and David were free for our usual Sunday dinner. Julian is driving down too. We'd love to see you. Are we going? David asked, looking at the phone. We are going, I said, closing my laptop with a firm click. But we aren't going for Sunday dinner. We are going for an audit. I spent the next 3 days doing what I do best, gathering disclosures. I pulled every public deed transfer, every corporate mortgage filing, and every cross-referenced asset tied to Apex Ridge Acquisitions LLC. I didn't find a single leaking pipe. I found a massive, beautifully engineered pipeline that had been diverting family wealth away from me for over half a decade. When Sunday arrived, the weather was bright and deceptively peaceful. We drove over to my parents' suburban home, the trunk of my car carrying a neat, professional briefcase filled with certified county records. As we walked up the porch steps, the front door opened and Julian stood there, wearing a fresh designer sweater and holding a glass of white wine. He gave me a cautious, defensive smile that told me everything I needed to know. The family had already spent the weekend coordinating their defense. The atmosphere inside the house was thick with an artificial warmth. My mother had laid out her best china, and the scent of roast chicken filled the dining room. My father sat at the head of the table, looking every bit the fragile retiree in his oversized cardigan, while Julian chatted amiably about the local housing market, carefully avoiding any mention of his own portfolio. I waited until the main course was finished, and my mother stood up to clear the plates. Mom, leave the dishes for a minute, I said, my voice quiet but holding that distinct, authoritative resonance I use during bank regulatory reviews. We need to talk about the screen share from Thursday. Julian immediately set his wine glass down, his posture turning rigid. My father didn't look up from his plate. His hands just tightened visually around his linen napkin. Clara, dear. That was just Julian's work portfolio, my mother said, offering a strained, fluttering laugh as she sat back down. It's all very complicated corporate business. There's really no need to bring it up at Sunday dinner. It isn't complicated at all, Mom, I said, reaching into my briefcase on the floor and pulling out 3 neatly bound copies of the corporate registry and deed histories. I slid one to my father, one to Julian, and kept one in front of me. This is Apex Ridge Acquisitions, LLC. It's a private residential real estate firm funded entirely by the Miller family. The trust Dad told me was liquidated 10 years ago to cover his medical retirement. Julian scoffed, pushing the folder away with his index finger. Clara, you're stepping completely out of your lane here. What I do with my corporate clients is private. You can't just use your bank credentials to pry into my life. I didn't use a single bank credential, Julian, I replied evenly, looking him dead in the eye. Every single document in that folder is a matter of public county record. Anyone with an internet connection and 20 minutes can access it. But as a compliance officer, I just happen to know exactly how to read the fine print. My father finally looked up, his eyes old and defensive. We worked our entire lives for that money. Clara, what we choose to do with our estate is our business. We wanted to ensure the family assets stayed concentrated and secure. And by family, you meant Julian? I asked, looking between my parents. You let me work 80-hour weeks to pay for my own wedding because you were living on a fixed income. You let David and me buy your medication while you were underwriting multi-million-dollar commercial mortgages for my brother. The dining room fell into a suffocating silence. My mother looked at her husband, then at her son, her face pale under the soft chandelier light. The sweet, fragile matriarch act was entirely gone, replaced by the cold reality of a family caught in a calculated exclusion. You don't understand the pressures of managing an estate of this size. Clara! my father said, his voice hardening into a defensive growl. Julian has a business degree. He understands wealth preservation. You chose a career in local banking. We made a strategic decision to keep the core capital unified. You made a decision to treat your daughter like an outsider while using her for free labor, David said, his voice steady and calm as he spoke up for the first time. Clara has spent 4 years feeling guilty for asking you to buy a ticket to her own wedding events. That wasn't strategy, Arthur. That was cruelty. Julian stood up, his face flushed. Look, if this is just about money, we can talk about a distribution payout from the LLC cash flow. There's no need to make this a legal issue. It's already a legal issue. Julian, I said, sliding a final sheet of paper across the table. I reviewed the terms of the original Miller family trust that funded your LLC. The trust was established by my grandfather, and under Section 4, any corporate entity funded by the principal must provide an annual financial disclosure to all living descendants of the bloodline. You haven't filed a single disclosure with me in 5 years. Julian's mouth snapped shut. He looked down at the document, his eyes wide as he realized that my grandfather's archaic trust verbiage had just dismantled his corporate shield. I don't want a cash payout from your LLC, Julian, I told him firmly, and I don't want your excuses. I want my grandfather's original intent honored, or my attorney files a formal petition for breach of trust disclosure on Monday morning. My father sank back into his chair, looking truly fragile for the first time, not because of his age, but because he had lost control of the script. He looked at Julian, who slowly sat back down, nodding once in a silent acknowledgement of defeat. They knew that a public court battle over trust concealment would freeze the LLC's credit lines and completely halt their active acquisition schedule. What are your terms, Clara? My father asked, his voice barely a whisper. The legal restructuring took exactly 3 weeks. Because Uncle Arthur's broad legal network intervened to avoid a public family scandal, the paperwork was handled quietly, professionally, and without a single shouting match. The Apex Ridge Acquisitions LLC was legally reorganized. The original capital structure was dismantled, and a mandatory independent trust account was established for my side of the family, funded immediately with an amount equivalent to Julian's initial corporate equity share. Furthermore, the agreement removed my father as the sole discretionary trustee, replacing him with an independent financial fiduciary who ensures that all future estate distributions are split down the middle, strictly by the book. We didn't stay for dessert that Sunday, and we haven't been back to my parents' house since. The relationship with my family has shifted into a quiet, distant compliance. There are no more monthly Zoom calls, no more artificial family dinners filled with hidden bank accounts, and no more performance of poverty. The air between us is cold, but it is finally clean. This evening, David and I sat out on our small backyard patio, watching the sunset over the neighborhood trees. For the first time in 4 years, the ambient anxiety of our financial future wasn't sitting on my chest like a physical weight. The lawyer confirmed the transfer cleared this afternoon, I said, taking a sip of my tea. Maya's college fund is fully secured, and our home mortgage is entirely paid off. David reached across the small table and took my hand, his thumb gently rubbing my knuckles. How do you feel? I feel steady, I said honestly, looking out at the quiet yard. I used to think family loyalty meant carrying their burdens without asking questions. Now I know that real loyalty doesn't hide behind a corporate shield. We still have a long road of personal healing ahead of us. Disentangling a lifetime of favoritism and structural lies takes time. But as I looked at my husband, knowing that our daughter's future was finally safe from the games of the generations before us, I knew the balance sheet had finally been settled. We weren't living on their fixed income anymore. We were finally standing on our own solid ground.